Okay. All right. I think we can get started now. My name is Sarah Season, and I'm chair of the Sierra Club Massachusetts Chapter Plant-Based Planet team. Our mission is to raise awareness of the environmental effects of animal agriculture and encourage people to eat plant-based food. Today, we are very fortunate to have a guest speaker, Dr. Joel Ginn of Boston College, of the Social Influence and Social Change Lab there, and he does research on social psychology. So now, without further ado, please, Joel, could you start? And let's see. I would like to say this is being recorded, just so that you know.
Great, thank you. Let me set this up. Everyone can see my slides, right?
Yes.
All right, great. Well, thank you for having me today. As Sarah mentioned, I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Boston College, where I'm calling in from right now in Boston, from the ancestral land of the Massachusetts people. And I'm going to be talking today about some behavioral tools or levers that we can think about when trying to promote pro-environmental behavior, how people are influenced by their social context and their social environment, and how we can use those types of influences to promote pro-environmental decision-making. Now, this is an audience where I don't really feel like I need to say much about the urgency of climate change. It is, for many people, the issue of the day that many of us are experiencing through extreme weather events and heat waves. It's something that is omnipresent, and people around the world have cried for addressing it through various means. While there have been some who have cried out that really only structural issues are the solution to this, we really take the perspective that it's not incompatible to have structural change as well as individual level change. And in fact, many people around the world really endorse the idea that individual action is necessary. In a sample that we've collected, we found that about 80% of Americans believe that both individual action as well as structural and policy changes are needed to address climate change. That said, that there's high demand for individual action doesn't necessarily track with what level of action people are taking in their day-to-day lives right now. There's a gap between what people think we should be doing and what people actually do. And that's where social scientific fields like social psychology can come in to help try to address that gap and shift people towards more pro-environmental decision-making. Now, psychology as a field is well suited to the study of this because psychology is the study of human thought and behavior. In social psychology, we study the impact of our social settings on our decision-making and behavior. Things like the physical environment around us, perceptions of what others are doing, beliefs about other people in our social sphere, and many other external factors that influence our behavior. This field of work is able to highlight areas of social influence and what factors might shift people's behavior towards pro-environmental decision-making, or what might act as barriers to action. Because we know that people are not wholly rational actors, behavior is not guided entirely by conscious rational thought processes. Things like habit and unconscious processes are large drivers of action, as are social factors like our social identities or our beliefs about social norms. By studying these factors and what influences our behavioral choices, we can design interventions that can subtly shift people, nudging them towards more sustainable behaviors. Now, what I'm hoping to talk about today is not going to be a broad coverage of everything that social psychology can say about how to influence behavior. I'll mention many things at the end that can be additional tools that if you look for yourself, there might be other levers there that you can consider. But rather, I'm going to focus on three things that we've been doing research on in our lab here that have been shown to be really impactful in shifting people's behavior, that you can think of as first tools in a toolkit that help shift people in a decision-making framework. The first of which will be social norms and how they can be a powerful behavioral influence, but also how they can be used to motivate even counter-normative behaviors. We'll also be looking at social identity and how that can both help and hinder environmental action, and how it can interact with messaging around promoting pro-environmental behavior to make it more or less effective. And finally, we'll touch on choice architecture and choice environments, using things such as choice defaults as a way to achieve behavioral change through structural intervention that doesn't directly engage with people on a person-to-person level. Now, for most of the studies that I'll be talking about and most of the findings, I'll be using examples about meat reduction and climate change. This is something that my work and work of others have focused on for a few reasons, one of which is that just remains one of the most impactful individual decisions that people can make in their day-to-day lives in terms of mitigating their carbon footprint. As seen by the figure here on the right, it is among the most high-impact behaviors that people can do, where this red arrow here indicating eat a plant-based diet and its annual climate savings in tons of CO2. It's maybe not as impactful as things like taking fewer flights or switching to entirely car-free life, but it is much more impactful than things like hang drying clothes, recycling, or using cold water in washing machines, things that are readily accepted by the public but have relatively much less influence. Also, this is an interesting area of study for many psychologists because of the psychological richness of this as a behavior. Certainly, meat reduction has a lot of rational components that people might consider when making decisions about how their about their diet. Things like their environmental benefits, the impact that it has on their health, and the impact that it has on animal welfare. But there are factors such as habit, cultural influences, social influences, and their own social identity that can influence people's decisions in this domain. So we won't be touching on this literally every study that I talk about, but there will be a recurring theme of how can we shift people to more sustainable diets, to eat less meat, as an example of these psychological tools. Now, first, we're going to be talking about social norms and conformity. Social norms being perceptions that people have about what people in society do or believe. And people generally conform to social norms because it can be really adaptive. If people believe that most people do XYZ, they're also generally going to conform to that compared to if they didn't have that information or if they believe that people didn't do those. They do this for a few reasons. One being informational influence. People kind of intuit based on social norms. If they think that people are doing something en masse, it's probably because other people know something that we might not know ourselves. If I see that everyone is driving cars in my neighborhood, I might intuit that there's probably some reason why they're doing that. Whether or not I know that reason, I will probably act in line according to that. There's also reputational influences, though, where people fear consequences of appearing deviant. We know that there are many counter-normative identities that people hold in society, things like that we'll talk about in this talk, like being an environmentalist, being vegan, things like that that are seen as counter-normative and stigmatized. People conform to social norms out of fear of being stigmatized and being associated with those types of norm deviants. Now, there are two types of social norms that we generally study in the field of psychology, one being descriptive norms. This is what people do. This is describing behavior. So I could say 70% of people own cars. That's a descriptive norm. An injunctive norm is instead what people believe or what they think others should do. It's a prescriptive belief. So it's saying, what do most people endorse or believe? So I might say 70% of people endorse the Green New Deal. That's the distinction between the two, is behavior and belief. And people do conform to both of these. But the question is, how can you use these norms to shift behavior? One of the most basic tools is just making these norms salient or visible, and that can induce behavior. The classic study of this in the field of sustainability psychology is using real energy bills that were sent to people. This has become commonplace among many energy suppliers now, but at the time this was not really done. What you'll see here on the right is that you get a report of your kilowatt hours that you used in the last month. And people will signal social norms by showing what your neighbors, a relevant social reference group, other people who are around and presumably at least somewhat like you that you want to conform to, they're using less energy than you. Because of this type of messaging and type of information provision, people actually reduce their energy use when they get this type of information compared to people who got a bill that didn't have that comparative information. So feedback messaging about electricity usage rates can influence people's decision making. When they're told about how they compare their neighbors, people change. But importantly in this example, the you in this case was higher than your neighbors. If you are lower than your neighbors, do you conform the other way? Some research suggests that's the case, but that's where people can use other tools as well to supplement this. So even when you're doing good, affective feedback or emotional feedback can help. So you can see here on the right, I've highlighted in this box here, how you're doing. It says room to improve for this example. If someone was akin to the efficient neighbors in this case, they're doing really good, using much less energy than the typical person in their neighborhood, they would get a little thing with two smiley faces there. It's a little hard to see maybe, but it's saying, yeah, you're doing really great. You're doing better and you should continue to do better. That can fight the normative influence to kind of go back to the norm and actually use more energy. So we can use social norms in tandem with emotional information like that to shift people down towards more sustainable behaviors. Now, these norm messaging pieces of information can be helpful or they can be harmful. When things are common or uncontentious, it's easy to get people to conform. You can just highlight those existing norms, you can model behavior on your own. But when many of the most individual actions people can take are counter-normative, it leaves an open question of what do we do? Do we tell people that things are counter-normative? How can we use norms in that way? Highlighting that only a few people do something might actually solidify that it's counter-normative and push people away from doing that. So how do you get people to adapt to counter-normative behavior? Well, the first thing is to make sure it's actually counter-normative. When we're talking about social norms, we're talking about people's perceptions or beliefs of social norms. People hold some belief about what most people do or what most people approve of, but we aren't omnipotent beings. We aren't 100% accurate about the world and what these norms actually are, and people might be in a state of what we call pluralistic ignorance, where they think something is counter-normative when it's actually the norm. You can see here on the right a cartoon that, or a comic that shows that people in general are voting aye for some passage of some policy of this company, but everyone's thought bubble is saying, perish thought, heaven forbid, no, 1,000 times no. They're all disagreeing with it. They all individually think it's a bad idea, but they think that everyone else around them thinks it's a good idea, so they conform to what they think is the actual norm. This was originally studied in the setting of college drinking, where students going off to college often think that everyone around them thinks that drinking at college and binge drinking is the norm that's approved of, when really most people don't actually approve of that. Most people are fine with people not drinking or not drinking to excess. When you highlight that norm, it actually shifts people's behavior. What does this have to do with the domain of climate change? Well, people in general think that people aren't worried, that people don't support climate policy, and that they aren't willing to pay to address climate change. But two recent papers that have come out have shown that people drastically underestimate all of these factors. On the right, you can see this figure here that shows the distribution of what people think the prevalence or support or agreement with each of these 5 different policies or just general concern of climate change is. This black box showing the mean level there. So just under 50% of people think that on average, only about 50% of people are worried about climate change. They think that maybe only about 30% of people support a carbon tax. These red lines are the actual support or agreement. So people are underestimating what support for each of these policies are. On the left here is a similar study done in a multinational context. On the right is just America. Here it's a multinational context and showing that consistently across many countries across the globe, when asked, would you be willing to pay some portion of your income to fight climate change, to address climate change? 69% of people said they'd be willing to do that, they'd be willing to pay, but they thought that on average only 43% of people would be willing to pay. The degree of that difference changes from country to country, but we can see consistently people underestimate how many people actually support these policies or action. So we can use this to see that people think things are counter-normative when they aren't actually. You might be able to address that in a few ways. This isn't just true of belief about climate change or endorsement of policies. We can also think about different strategies meant to address climate change. There are common recurring narratives in climate media about how we're going to address climate change. And we asked people in the study, what % of Americans would you believe agree with each statement of each way to address climate change? Things like, we need both behavior and policy to address climate change. It's too late, we don't need to adapt, or it's not too late, we don't need to start adapting to climate change, we still need to mitigate. Things like ultra-wealthy saviors are the way that we address climate change, or that we only need policy change. And what we have here on the right is a black dot that shows what the perceived percentage of Americans that agree with these things are, and the actual real percentage that agree with it. So what we can see is that some of these popular narratives, like the idea that we need both policy and behavior change, are underestimated by people by 20 to 30%. And this is true across the political aisle for most of these narratives. People generally endorse it, but think it's less popular than it actually is. There are some unpopular narratives, like the idea of endorsing free market solutions, or that it's too late and we just need to adapt, that people are somewhat accurate on, and people actually overestimate the prevalence of some narratives, like the idea that climate change isn't that serious, or that's the future generation's problem. In general, we can say that people have a muted view of mitigation support, including these narratives that challenge the status quo. So we can say that there's a lot of pluralistic ignorance around climate change, and that we can address that in a few ways. First of which is just speaking openly about your beliefs, and that can act as a social signal. People might not know that it's a really popular thing to be concerned about climate change, to endorse policy solutions and things like that. Speaking openly can signal to others that some people do care, and that can then have a ripple effect where then those people might be more willing to speak about their own beliefs, and it goes on and on. You can also just share information, like what I just presented there, about the true norm, and that can shift people's perceptions. We know that social media can be a really important place for people to take in information, and if you speak openly and honestly about the true percentage of how many people really care about these issues, that can lead to behavior change. And importantly, for some of these narratives that are widely endorsed across the political divide, we can highlight consensus, and that can be really impactful. There's a long literature on the importance of highlighting scientific consensus and the percentage of scientists that agree that climate change is an issue that needs to be addressed. The same thing works with the public. When you say X% of the public really cares about this, it can really signal that it's a normative thing to be concerned about this across social and political divides, and that can induce behavior change. Now, that's for things that are actually normative that people think are counter-normative. That's addressing pluralistic ignorance. But some things are just actually counter-normative. Some things most people in society don't do, but are things that we probably should do more frequently. So how can we capitalize on things like social trends to address these issues? We can message about things like dynamic norms, how things are changing, and people can be nudged to conform to things like this. We see all the time in the domain of meat reduction that people are eating less meat. Meatless alternatives are on the rise. There's this general perception in society that Americans are becoming more and more vegetarian friendly and eating less and less meat. This is something that we can capitalize on. It's not seen to be that most people don't eat meat, but instead that it's on the rise. And it's a question of, does that actually influence behavior? And there are several studies that have shown that, yeah, people conform to these counter-normative but increasing behaviors for a few reasons. Some of these being things like perceptions of what the future norm will be. People think that people are becoming more and more vegetarian. They might think, in a few years or a few decades, the society will be mostly plant-based. I'm just going to pre-conform to what I think that norm will be. Or it can act as a signal that, yeah, maybe most people actually just care about this and want to be vegetarian right now or reduce their meat consumption right now, and they just haven't been acting in line with that, but they're starting to, so maybe I can join in on this movement. As an example study that showed the effectiveness of this, my postdoctoral advisor here at Boston College, Greg Sparkman, ran a study at a live dining establishment where people came in, did a brief survey, and then got a meal, and they got a $5 coupon for their lunch. And they were able to track data through that coupon to see which meal they ordered. People coming in as part of the survey received one of three messages. They either got a static norm saying 30% of Americans make an effort to limit their meat consumption. It's saying what the current norm is, and that's quite low. The dynamic norm message said that in the last 5 years, 30% of Americans have started to make an effort to reduce their meat consumption. So it's the dynamic norm, that things are changing. And in the control condition, they were just told something about 30% of Americans have started to limit the amount of time they spend on Facebook. It's about a norm, but it's unrelated. What they did was they tracked the orders of meatless dishes at this establishment, and they can see, as you might expect, in the control and static norm conditions, just about 20% or less people ordered meatless dishes. But when they were given that dynamic norm message, that jumped from 17% to 34%. That's double the amount of meatless dishes that were ordered as a result of just being told that 30% of people had started to make an effort to reduce their meat consumption. And this has been shown to be scalable in a project with over 10,000 restaurant dishes sold at a few different locations, where on the menu there was just a simple message saying that meatless dishes are on the rise. People pretty consistently have shifted towards meatless dining. Now, it's not getting everyone to do it, and it's not getting people to go fully vegetarian, but this is a way to start that behavioral shift and induce people to engage in some behavior change that is currently counter-normative, but using strategic messaging can shift people in that way. This, as I said, works for a few ways, and part of the way it works is that it can overcome some common psychological barriers. Some barriers to change that people regularly run into is that people think that most people don't do that behavior. So there's that social reputational influence that we talked about. They also doubt change is possible. They don't think they're able to do it. They have a really fixed mindset about, I can do XYZ, but I can't do that. They also believe that change isn't necessarily important enough. They have difficulty overcoming habit. People have a general bias towards things that are familiar. And they think it might not be identity relevant. It's not for people like me. People who are doing this are different people. But if you see these dynamic messages that some people are changing, it kind of overcomes each of those in turn. It's saying most people don't do that behavior, but they're on the rise. So some people are doing that. If people doubt change is possible, they're starting to see that it is possible for some people, so maybe it's possible for me. They don't believe change is important enough. They don't believe change is important enough. Clearly other people think that change is important, so I should hop on the bandwagon. And if behavior is not for people like me, if you're saying that more and more people are doing it, potentially people like me are actually joining in as well. So there are ways that you can influence counter-normative behaviors in this way. Others change broadly leads us to reconsider these barriers that we thought existed and consider them in a different light. That's not to say every norm message will work. I can tell you from designing some of these studies that it can be sometimes difficult to get a norm message that is the most effective it can be. Some general tips in terms of if you're trying to tell people about norms and ways to make them more effective, you've got to make sure the message is believable. If I tell you that 60% of people have started to eat meatless diets, no one's going to believe that. That's not something people are just going to ignore because it doesn't seem real. Try to use real messages or things that at least seem to be real and are based in some current social reality. You also want to make sure the normal referent, or rather the group of people that you're talking about in the norm, is thought to be people like me. So if I say that 30% of Americans are doing something, it's going to be different than if I say 30% of Democrats or 30% of people in Boston. The relevant group, the norm referent, is important in terms of having the norm message be effective. And finally, you want to avoid reactants. These are not requests, but an invitation to join in. You're telling people what most people are doing. You're not pairing that necessarily with, and you should too. Because sometimes people can react negatively when they're being told what to do. People like to, particularly in independent nations like the United States, really want to express their individuality and don't like being told what to do, but they still respond to these types of subtle influences by just telling you what most people do. There are many other things I could talk about with social norms, but for now we're going to shift over to talking about social identity and how that can be impactful. Social identity has a long history in social psychology in terms of its influence on our behavior. Social identity theory really focuses around how we define ourselves by the social groups we belong to. The idea being that we have many identities as we go through our day-to-day life. If you think about the statement, I am blank, you might fill that in with any number of things, like race, gender, occupation, the city you live in, a hobby that you have, any number of things that hold different levels of importance and might be more or less salient in different contexts. And they might be more impactful depending on how broad or narrow they are. For example, I might say I'm an American, but I might also say I'm a citizen of Massachusetts. One of these is probably more relevant and more influential to me. And even more so, more narrowly, I'm someone who lives in Boston, a Bostonian. It's something that's probably going to be more influential to me than saying something about trying to manipulate me through messaging around being someone from Massachusetts or messaging about being an American. We know that identity-based motivation can be a really powerful thing we're motivated to act in line with those identities. We keep those in mind, and whether an behavior seems relevant or in line with our identity in question. So we approach behaviors that are consistent with an identity, and we tend to avoid behaviors that are inconsistent with an identity. In the realm of environmental decision making, you can think about this, for example, with femininity and masculinity. There is a long history of environmentalism and environmental efforts being associated with femininity, or traditional femininity within the United States at least. This is happening both implicitly and in some cases explicitly, that greenness is associated with femininity, and on the opposite end, very unsustainable behaviors are associated with masculinity. This can have many other types of effects beyond just feminine approach, masculine avoid. People who have their masculinity threatened, for example, will tend to avoid green products. If you tell someone who identifies as male something that threatens their masculinity, they'll want to reinforce that in some way, and green products are the way to go. On the other hand, if you affirm their masculinity, green products are then seen as okay. But green actors are, and also if green actions are framed as macho, that's also okay. You can see this a bit with automobiles in the United States, and how green cars and electric cars have really shifted in their image over the last several years, where things like Tesla have been more associated as a luxury item and associated with a certain type of masculinity that makes them more appealing to men who might otherwise have looked down on 10, 15 years ago a traditional electric car. There are other types of identities that become more or less salient in this domain, such as identification as an environmentalist. We've seen through Pew studies that fewer and fewer people in America are identifying as environmentalists. And this could be for a few reasons. It's potentially due to the politicized perception people have about being an environmentalist. Some identities are not as socially desirable as others, and people in society now generally see environmentalist as a label as being really politicized, and there's particular stigma against environmental activists that people deem typical activists, people who speak out about the political side of issues. If you're trying to get people to take action, you might become more stigmatized, or that identity might become more stigmatized than, say, someone who says they're environmentalist, but what that means is that they have a garden, they compost, they're not trying to tell others what to do. This isn't to say that we shouldn't try to promote environmentalist identification, and that type of identity can have a lot of positive benefits, but it's something that we can see that identities and their social status can shift over time, and that can change what people are willing to do if they're willing or unwilling to become associated with that identity. For example, in the realm of meat reduction, we know that vegetarians are perceived in many stigmatized ways. In some ways, they're seen not necessarily as outright negative. There are some things like they're seen as less masculine, particularly for male vegetarians, that they're pacifistic, weak, they're seen as liberal, very health conscious. People do see vegetarians often as being very moral individuals, but that's often paired with things like a holier than thou or judgmental tone that vegetarians are seen to be looking down on non-vegetarians. And particularly, vegetarians are viewed more negatively by certain groups of people, like authoritarians and men. But this isn't necessarily true of everyone who reduces their meat consumption. This is stereotypes that people have about vegetarians and vegans. And there's been a rise of other alternatives that we can use to use a social identity approach to message to people more effectively. For example, there's been a rise of what we might call reducitarianism or flexitarianism. So people have shifted their diet, but maybe only partially or only in some domains. So some people have set rules where they don't go completely meatless, but they have rules like Meatless Monday where they don't eat meat on Monday, or Vegan before 6 where they, before 6 p.m., don't eat meat or animal products, but after 6 p.m. it's okay. It's a self-imposed rule to reduce meat consumption without giving it up. Other people have pescatarian diets or no red meat they engage in for a number of reasons, and some people just generally eat less meat. There have been some NGOs, for example, the Reducitarian Foundation, that have popped up to try to support this type of movement and really emphasize that it's not an all or nothing thing. Their core values on their About Us page reads here, in a few words, it's not all for nothing. We celebrate the small changes in personal and institutional behavior that collectively result in a significant difference in the world. So there are alternative approaches. The idea of asking people, can you reduce your meat rather than give it up, but also if that message is coming from a reducitarian versus a flexitarian versus a vegetarian, is that going to have a different impact in terms of how that message lands? People are willing to listen and actually go along with what that message is. So broadly, do appeals to reduce lead to more change than restriction appeals? And do people feel differently about flexitarians or reducitarians than vegetarians? And what we found in some research is that, yes, flexitarian appeals lead to less meat consumption in a study here over 6 months compared to a vegetarian message. People were given an intervention at month 0 here, where you can see how they compare to a control condition. There was a drop-off in both conditions. Both of them weren't compared to a control. But you can see over time, the reducitarian op-ed led to a greater reduction in meat consumption than the eliminate op-ed. So this effect is both more impactful and more impactful over the long term. And flexitarian messaging led to, in a different study, an increased willingness to talk about meat reduction with others and on social media compared to a vegetarian message. That's part of the messaging approach of the Reducitarian Foundation, is that this message will spread further and create a more collective movement, rippling out and getting everyone in society to collectively reduce a little bit of their meat consumption rather than getting a few people to go all in. So the idea here is that it's a more identity compatible behavior. You're getting these messages often from flexitarians or reducitarians who might not even use that label. It might just be someone who says like, yeah, I reduce my meat consumption, but I still eat chicken and eggs from time to time. That, compared to a stigmatized identity of vegetarianism, can lead to a greater appeal. So broadly, we can say, yeah, flexitarian messages shift people's dietary behavior and their social behavior. This works for potentially a few reasons. One could be that it's seen as easier and less restrictive. On face value, we can say it's easier to reduce meat than it is to give it up. But it's also, as I said, more identity compatible. You don't have to become a vegetarian, for example. There's work on the idea of moral minority practice-based identities, where things like vegans, vegetarians, even things like lycra cyclists hold a stigmatized identity in certain societies, and people to engage in that type of pro-environmental behavior have to take on that identity in a certain way. But by using a reducitarian or flexitarian appeal, you can kind of bypass that. It also gives you maybe excuses for reducing but not eliminating. There's been some research that shows that people who reduce their meat consumption, but for health reasons rather than environmental or animal reasons, are not seen the same way. In the same way, people who reduce are not judged in the same way, and they can give some reasons for why they're reducing their meat consumption, but maybe having given it up, that might be more appealing to a non-vegetarian audience. And potentially people are more receptive to messages from similar others. People like reducitarians and flexitarians aren't othered in the same way that a vegetarian might be. So there's many reasons why this might work. I do want to highlight that this is not meant to say that vegetarian appeals shouldn't exist in society. It's something that we should still push for broadly. Like many people believe that we should have a fully vegetarian society or fully plant-based society, and vegetarians and vegans and messaging around that are an important part of the entire social network. But in the short term, in terms of getting people to at least take that first step, a reduced appeal might be a more influential first step there. Now, broadly, what can we say about how to create identity compatibility and make these messages more effective? The first is that we use messengers that are appealing or seen as similar to your target audience, as seen with the flexitarian messaging. You can also flip and rebrand identity associations. As we said, masculinity is not typically associated with either meat consumption or environmentalism, but when you can use very masculine or stereotypically masculine messengers as an appeal, for example, right here, Arnold Schwarzenegger doesn't eat meat, we can say, we can use a very traditionally masculine target as a way of highlighting that these aren't incompatible and actually making it seem more macho to do this behavior. You can also avoid identity dimensions that are contrary to the audience and key aspects that work for your audience. So for example, if you're talking about reducing meat consumption and you're talking to people from the Cattlemen's Association, you're not necessarily going to talk about the health benefits of a plant-based diet. You might talk about things that are relevant to them as an American, as someone who cares for animal welfare. You might care, et cetera, et cetera. There's many reasons or identities that can be made salient. You don't want to target an audience with something that is actually contrary to that audience. And finally, some research has shown that you want to avoid associations with vegetarian and vegan labels, both in terms of people and the products themselves. Things like plant-based or just giving it entirely a new name has actually led to increases in people's acceptance of products compared to if they're just called a vegetarian burger. So that is social identity. We've talked about social norms and social identity, things about how you think about yourself, what you think about other people, but the choice environment and the literal environment around you can be a really impactful area of study as well. Now, when we're talking about social context, it's important to note that the physical environment guides decision-making as well. It's not just people. You might be familiar with this in terms of grocery store layout. When you come in, things are laid out in a very specific way to push people to go around the entire perimeter of the store, to go to the back, to go to the front, to go around the perimeter and see as many products as possible to get people to try to buy more products, buy specific products. This is the idea of choice architecture, where you design decision environments to influence people's choices. And a specific type of intervention that we look at in our research is choice defaults, where you set up one option as the default that the consumer gets if they do nothing. An example of this, not in an environmental domain, but just to show the impact of this in society, is the role of defaults as an opt-in versus opt-out type of behavior. So you can see here on the right, there are different types of policies where you opt into something or opt out, in this case, organ donation. Some countries have a system where if you want to be part of the organ donation program, you have to explicitly sign up for it. That's opt-in. Others have presumed consent, that you have to opt out. You are an organ donor until you say otherwise. And some researchers looked at organ donation rates in different countries that have explicit opt-in or opt-out policies. And what they find is that in opt-in countries, organ donation rates are actually quite low, as you might expect. But then the opposite happens when it's an opt-out policy. Simply just changing what the default option is, and whether by making a choice you're opting in or opting out, can really shift people's behavior and society's net result as a result of that. We can see this happening in climate change domains as well. There's results here from this German city where people were randomly assigned to either get their energy from their current energy mix or a green energy program. And what we can see is that opt-in versus opt-out, again, there's this drastic shift where in the opt-in side of things, only 7% of households opted into the green energy program, whereas 69% opted in the opt-out setting. In some of our work, we've started to look at this type of structural intervention in how we can shift people towards plant-based dining. And we did this in college dining cafeterias, where we tracked the data across 3 different universities over the course of 3 months, where on each day of the study, a station in the dining hall was randomly assigned to either be a no default control or a vegan default. The no default control being that 2 dishes are presented side by side, same dish, in this case a beef bulgogi and a tofu bulgogi that are side by side, same type of dish, just difference in whether the protein is plant or animal based, and the signage indicated that both were available. Under the vegan default, we only show the plant-based option and say that the meat one is available on request. So this is not opt-in versus opt-out. This is opt-out and want meat reduction versus point to the one you want. So this is potentially an even softer version of what we were looking at before. And what we did was we tracked the number of servings on each day of the study of each of these types of dishes. And what we find is that under the no default, business as usual, people generally order meat dishes. They accounted for about 73% of the total sales on that day. But under the vegan default, meat dishes accounted for only 42% of sales. When we look at the intervention effect as the interaction between dish type and experimental condition of whether it's a no default control or a vegan default, we can see that there were 57% fewer meat dishes served on intervention days compared to no default days, and 58% more plant-based dishes served. So this can be a quite drastic shift, and we're not telling participants anything. We're not telling people that most people are doing XYZ. We're not telling people about the importance of eating plant-based diet. We're simply just changing how options are presented to diners, and it can lead to pretty drastic shifts. Now, defaults work in a few potential ways. First of which, touching back on what we talked about at the top of the talk, they signal social norms. People intuit that most people go with the default, and that it must be the default because most people do that option. It can also signal institutional values, what people, both within the organization that is running the thing, in this case college dining halls, as well as what other people believe is the right thing to do. You're signaling that plant-based dining is something you value and people can conform to that. It also signals ease of effort. It's often easier to go with the default rather than trying to opt out of that. Other options can also seem less salient, so people might just not know what other options are. That might feel like a trick in some cases, but that's also the case when the reverse is happening. In many dining scenarios, a meat-based option is the default, and people might not even know that a vegetarian option is available. And finally, they're pretty innocuous. People often don't recognize or react to defaults. In some studies where people ran these types of default studies like what we presented here, they asked people after the fact, did you notice anything about the dining hall setup? And only a single-digit % of people actually noted that the options were displayed in a different way. Something like 8% of people said that they recognized it, but most people did not. Now, not all defaults are created
Joel?
equally. Yes?
Okay, I'm sorry, let's see, it's almost 7:45 now. Do you think you could wrap up in the next 5 minutes and then we'll have
Absolutely.
for Q&A?
Absolutely, yes. Almost to the end now. So yeah, there are multiple ways to use defaults and shift them to be more or less effective. You can change things like option order, explicitly calling things a default, having things be explicitly an opt-in versus opt-out policy. You also importantly need to make the defaulted option appealing. You can't just present something as the default, and if it's not appealing, people won't go for it. You can also, as I said, this didn't come with any partnered messaging, but you can pair it with other messaging and say most people get X to try to double up on your intervention, make it more effective. So that's coming to a close. What can we take away from these studies on reducing meat consumption and promoting pro-environmental decision making more broadly? Put simply, behavior change is complex. There's a lot of things that influence behavior change, but we know that there are some factors that influence this. Social identity and social norms shape our beliefs and behavior, and we know that decision-making frameworks using things like choice defaults and other choice architecture, they can be shifted to nudge people towards sustainable options. There are things you can do like highlighting good or hidden norms and counter-normative trends. You can use effective messengers and make these messages more identity compatible. And you can use things like choice architecture where you have structural control to be able to make the options you want people to engage in seem like the default, either explicitly or implicitly. As I said, there's a lot of things that you could consider that I didn't get into today. Things like the role of habit, perceived behavioral control, emotion, moral licensing. These are things that you can think about as part of your toolkit in promoting pro-environmental decision making. But broadly, I want people to come out of this considering the social context and how people might be influenced in any number of ways, thinking about norms, identity, and structural influences as only a part of that. You should use everything in your toolkit. These can be used in tandem with each other in quite effective ways. Thank you all, and I'm excited to hear what questions people have and engage in some discussion about this.
Okay, great. There were some questions in the chat. Let's see. And it's not showing up. Oh, because I'm yeah, it's not showing up on. Oh wait, yeah, here are some. Yes, someone wrote that now that people are eating less beef, they're eating more chicken. So how do we influence that?
Yeah, it's I present these things as pretty straightforward as you get people to eat less meat, and there's many ways to do that. But things become more complex when you get into very specific things. Like when you say eat less meat, it's like, well, what types of meat? Beef, by far, is the most impactful type of regularly consumed meat in terms of carbon emissions that people eat, particularly in Western societies. So many people have proposed, if we just replace beef with chicken, that should solve the issue. And to some extent, they're not wrong. Like, it does have a lower carbon footprint. For many people who care about animal welfare, it's kind of this double-edged sword where now environmental impacts are less, but you're killing more animals for the same amount of meat consumption. So I don't want to say it's the wrong approach. It's definitely a thing that people can consider as some benefit coming out of that. But we want to get people to shift more towards less meat consumption en masse. So I think highlighting some of these things, like not just saying people are shifting their diets towards chicken, but saying that more and more people are changing their diet in many ways, including the types of meat that they eat, both the type of animal, but also whether they're getting like organic, local, etc., um, as well as just changing how they eat broadly. Um, I don't know if that addresses the question completely, but that's at least some of the discussions that have been happening in the vegan space.
Okay, yes. And let's see. Marla Felcher said, oh yeah, you can ask questions if you'd like orally, go off mute. All right, and then chicken contributes to huge amounts of water pollution, and for those who live nearby, air pollution.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and give them some great vegetarian recipes or a taste of your own vegetarian dishes to promote a greater change.
Yeah,
And
that is something that's been highlighted by many people. Is just getting people to try something is really impactful. If you Most people aren't actually that necessarily averse to plant-based dishes until you label it as vegetarian or vegan, or you tell them to go vegetarian or vegan. If you put a plant-based something in front of someone, people are more than likely going to try it. Now, not everyone. Some people are pretty averse to things, especially if they are taking part in or really entrenched in like culture warfare around it. But if you put a vegetarian burger in front of someone, they're not necessarily going to be like, I'm not going to eat that. Like they'll try it, and that can be a first step of getting people exposed to the idea that maybe I can do this, maybe I do like this. Especially if you're cooking with someone, showing them, inviting them over for a night where you cook a vegetarian dish with them, it gives people a skill set and makes them feel like they can do something. As I said earlier in the talk, people might feel like they have low control over their diet. They don't know how to cook vegetarian. You teach them how to cook one or two dishes, and they might be more willing to engage in that.
oh yes, Marla.
Hi, thanks for doing this. It's something I've been working on and struggling with for years now. I feel like the animal welfare message has just not moved the needle very much. And I myself do a blog and am counting on the climate issue moving the needle. What's your hope for that? Like, do you feel that we have more that there's more hope in people paying attention to the climate issue than they do to animal welfare?
I think it's complex because I think when we see like animal welfare, it's not that people don't care about animals. Like there are some great books on the social psychology of meat consumption and, as some people call it, human-animal interactions, where some of these are titled like "Why We Love and Also Eat Animals," because people do love animals. It's just that a lot of people also think about they are less concerned about animal welfare than they are human welfare, um, and they maybe manifest that in different ways. Like many people think about animal welfare and talk about happy beef. They talk about free range, organic, because they're thinking about the animal's happy life prior to being slaughtered for consumption. Um, I think there are ways that you can maybe correct that, but I think that's also an optimistic thing that it's not a lost cause. I think people can care about animal welfare. It's just one of these things of, we talk about different types of messaging here. There's many things that maybe aren't as salient on people's minds when it comes to animal consumption and animal welfare. For example, the average age of animals when they're slaughtered. Many people think about happy beef and things like that, and think about an animal that's lived a pretty long and happy life, when in reality they haven't lived that long a life. So there are ways that we can maybe more optimize that message, and it is a type of message that can be really impactful in getting people to move the needle. If you think about things as like segmented needles, where you get people to go from fully omnivorous to vegetarian, or at least trending towards plant-based. Some of these other types of appeals can kind of push people even further. I can speak about my own trajectory. I was someone who went vegetarian for the climate. And as I got more and more open to plant-based diet, got over some of these psychological hurdles of like my own identification, how much control I felt that I had over my diet, I started to endorse more of these animal welfare issues, and that drove me to become more and more plant-based to the point that I'm fully vegan these days. it's something that you can think about who you're talking to. And if you're going to talk to someone who's been eating steak and potatoes their whole life and haven't tried anything, maybe an animal welfare approach isn't the right one. Um, but it is something that's really good for someone who's really conflicted because it can lead to maybe a more stark drop off and a more consistent drop off. Because some people who respond to these environmental appeals do trend towards reducing their meat consumption, but that's not necessarily dropping off fully. And some people drop off and then revert back to their old habits because as I said, habit is a very powerful force. So we need a mix of both in the entire ecosystem. Um, it's just that we know that maybe some of them are more appealing and more impactful on the like omnivorous public as a whole.
Thank you.
Okay.
You're
and,
invited to my house for dinner if you're vegan.
Thank you.
I'm a
where
good
where are
cook.
you where are you located?
Cambridge.
Cambridge. And are you a Sierra Club member?
Yes, I'm actually really good friends with Diana Goldman, who does your cooking shows. So
Oh,
we can
great.
talk offline about that.
Yes, we
Yeah.
can, sure. All right. Okay, great. All right. Well, let's see. I was going to ask you, Joel, how about promoting plant-based food as low fat and low calorie? Because if you think about it, most plant-based foods do have less fat, with the exception of things like nuts or oils or olives. Most do have less fat and fewer calories than, say, meat, eggs, and dairy, especially if you look at things like desserts. Has that worked at all?
Um, it's a bit of a mixed bag because dietary science as a whole becomes hard to talk about, like what is the effect of going vegetarian or vegan because of all the other aspects in the diet. Um, One thing that I can say is that pretty consistently, like looking at like the health of different diets, things like the Mediterranean diet have shown to be pretty healthy, where it's a lot of whole like plant-based food with some like fish and eggs, occasional meat that that's healthier than like a traditional Western diet. When you look at vegetarianism, it's easy to think about a fully wholly plant-based food where you're getting all your food from the farmer's market, you're making things at home. But many people in America and in Western society just don't have that skill set and don't feel comfortable with that skill set and are used to the types of foods that we're accustomed to. Things like very highly processed meats, which now there are readily available plant-based alternatives of. Things like pasta dishes that maybe are pretty analogous. Um, so speaking to like what the health benefits of a fully vegan and vegetarian diet are compared to a traditional Western diet, I think it's pretty unquestionable that there are some benefits and some pretty major benefits. Um, it's just been difficult for health science to specifically say like one of them is like 100% better on all accounts, and this is why, because of the inherent variability in saying like, what a vegetarian diet is. That said, when you do talk about these health benefits, you also have to consider what people are considering is a benefit or not. So some people think like all fats are good, all fats are bad. If you think about calorie counts are pretty unquestionable, but if you think about protein counts, like I'll say up front, a lot of people, particularly people who are really concerned about meat and protein and their connection, underestimate or just don't know how much protein there is in things that are plant-based proteins like tofu and beans and things like that. Um, but they actually will potentially engage in more meat consumption when you highlight these health concerns. Because if you think about the protein that you get, particularly men might look at that and say like, okay, plant-based diet is not going to be healthy for me because I have needs as someone who needs a lot of protein, so I'm not going to trend towards that. That's not to say health messaging doesn't help, but I think is one of these things where there's a lot of variability in like how you're talking about it, what things you highlight to what audience. It's less of a straightforward message than just saying this is better for the environment, this is better for animal welfare, things like that.
Okay, because one thing is, now if you think about it, it can be done. If we think about it during World War II, the government got people to eat less meat. eggs, dairy, fish, well, fish I don't know about, and sugar. These things were rationed. I mean, the meat was rationed because it was on the premise that we needed to save the protein for the fighting men and ship it overseas. So that's why the civilians had meat rationed. But the whole point being, it can be done. People did
Hmm.
consume less, and they grew a lot of vegetables in victory gardens. So, uh, is that ever used as an example of saying, we did it back then, we can do it again?
Uh, Not as frequently because coming from the field of social psychology and what we reference, we will look to anecdotal historical examples like that, but we will often look to the current context where we can study what's going on. So we've looked at collective things like at the beginning of COVID and the uptake of protective measures like mask wearing in public, and what made people more or less likely to actually wear masks in public, and what they thought people who wore masks in public. Um, I think there are things to be learned from those historical examples. Um, Things like promoting it as a national effort, and people who are really identified with that are willing to do that. There's also the term silver buckshot rather than a silver bullet. The idea that when you're trying to message there's a movement that we need people in society to do X, Y, Z, you can use the health appeal in tandem with other things. So saying using the World War example, we need to ration things to be able to sustain the war effort. We need to send our meat overseas, so you need to eat less meat at home. Um, that can get people to take that first step, which then can lead into habits where they are eating less meat. It's just also a different cultural context that where meat consumption at the time is not the same as it is in today in terms of its normative presence, in terms of the types and quantity of meat that we eat. Um, but I certainly think there are things we can learn from historical examples like that. Whether it's one-to-one still needs to be studied in the current context, but for sure there are lessons to be learned from that.
Right. Great. And let's see, it's now 8 p.m. Does anyone have any other questions for Joel?
You can see a hand raised, yeah?
Yeah. Yeah, you can go off mute.
Yeah, in World War II, the Victory Gardens started in the spring of 1942. And by 1945, they were producing about half of the fruits and vegetables consumed on the home front. That's an amazing thing.
Mhm.
3 growing seasons and it changed. So there's an example there that most people are not aware of. But my question to you is that it seems that for Republicans in this election, the 2 biggest issues are immigration and inflation. And both immigration and inflation are increasingly going to be driven by climate chaos as the years go on. They already are. The rise in the price of olive oil and so forth and so on. We can see this happening in terms of food. We can also see immigration around the world being driven by climate. How do you think that we can use those to maybe lever some change in our Republican brethren and sistren?
Mhm. It's a great question. Thank you for it. I will say up front, social psychology is a very diverse field, and there's a lot of people who study political psychology and really get into uh, the idea of political polarization and what drives that and what are the impacts of that. And I think that is so. There's probably some things that I'm going to omit or that I'm not as conscious of, but I'll try to address it as best I can. Um, One thing that we try to consider when we're thinking about these hot button political issues. One is just that many of these are talking points that are used by politicians in public media, and they're talked about as a single issue that's unconnected to other things. Um, Occasionally, there will be a link drawn between things, particularly for inflation, um, but it's often they choose what the rallying cry and what the talking points are for political purposes. People in society do tend to see things maybe a bit more interconnected than as it's shown in mainstream media. But that said, we could try to do more on an educational side of things, on how we talk about these things, there's this concept of systems thinking, the idea that things are interconnected in our world, and some people inherently see things as more interconnected than others. But that is a skill that can be induced in people. It's something that can be taught through the educational system. That's a very long-term solution. You need to start getting people to engage in that when they're young, and then hope that many years later that leads to these types of effects. In the short term, there's something that some people have talked about and considered that touches on what we talked about before, of moving the needle. I'm thinking about the movable middle, for example. I don't want to say ignore people who are on the opposite side of the political aisle, because it's important to have both a collective movement of people as large as you can make it, as well as making it not such a contentious issue that people who are on the opposite side of the aisle are so reactive that it's going to inflame a culture war around it. But there is some extent of you need to move who you can move effectively with different types of messaging. People who are independents, people who are more moderate conservatives, more moderate liberals, can all be shifted towards a more progressive social agenda incrementally. And to some extent, those people already endorse many climate solutions. As I mentioned at the top of the talk, most Americans actually endorse that climate change is an issue, support policy, and support different types of strategic actions of how we need to address these social issues. And that's true across the aisle. Of course, there are partisan differences, with Democrats endorsing more of these solutions than Republicans, but the gap is not as big as people perceive it to be, and a lot of that is due to the role of political moderates on both sides. So I think there are many conservatives that are concerned about climate change, but don't feel like they can talk about it because of the social influence of people who are around them. They think conservatives don't care about this. So in that case, there's a few things that can be done. One is talking to people one-on-one. The other is trying to highlight conservatives who do care about and talk about these issues. It's one thing to try to fight far-right movements. It's another to try to highlight more moderate conservatives who disagree with things but also might still care about climate policy and care about things. In terms of connecting them, connecting climate to inflation, I don't want to speak too much to that because it's not an area that I have a lot of expertise on, so I would just be giving my best guess as someone who exists in the world. But I'm sure that many people are already working on that or already have published work on that. I just don't know it offhand.
All right. Any other questions before we end this? No. Okay. Well, thank you, Joel, so much for a wonderful talk, for all of these perceptions and connections that we don't normally think of. But also, I would like to say one very important thing is that the way you showed the real perceptions versus what we think are the perceptions was really illuminating for me. How if we just craft our messages equally, we can, the right way, we can reach a lot more people. But thank you so much for your time, for a very informative talk. And as I told everyone at the beginning, we have recorded this talk, and it normally takes a few days for the recording to be made. And once it is, I will be sending it out through the Sierra Club system. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and a big round of applause for Joel.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Good night.